So let's flip back to chapter 19, 15th century art in Northern Europe. We're moving between Italy and the North, back and forth, to get an integrated picture of the 15th century. And we looked closely at 19.1, the Northern Renaissance, 19.2, where we talked about the ducal courts, and at painting in Flanders. We're going to jump here to the Germanic lands. We're not going to do everything. We never can. So here in 19.5, we have the Northern Renaissance style as it was expressed in the Germanic lands, the German-speaking regions, today's Germany and Switzerland. And they talk about painting and sculpture, which is worth your time if you have some extra time to spare. We did look briefly at the tradition of the carved wood altarpiece with some inset painted panels. But what really matters for us is in this section titled The Graphic Arts. This is the big deal. And it's a big deal because we get printmaking by about 1400. There are systems for making images and texts, or combining them, through printing presses. And this is tied to this incredible material that we take for granted, but was so important in the spread of knowledge, paper. Remember the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels? Remember how hundreds of calves or sheep were slaughtered to make parchment for those handmade books? Now, with paper and printing presses, Europeans begin to be able to mass produce books, often illustrated, on paper. So they're far less expensive, much more accessible, and they unleash the growth of new knowledge. Along with books, this new technology means the availability of single sheet artistic images that are made as reproducible works on paper. So all of this is called the graphic arts. And let's take a moment to check that definition. A dictionary definition would say the visual arts, the category of visual arts that are based on the use of line and tone rather than three-dimensional work or the use of color. So two-dimensional, not three-dimensional. Because, that's pretty clear. They're not three-dimensional. They're not sculpture. They're flat surfaces, images on a flat sheet of paper. What do they mean by not based on the use of color? These certainly have color, but they don't require color. They could be printed without the color. The color is filled in at a certain step. In other words, the image is constructed. It's built up through lines and through tones. Color is optional. This is different than painting, where in a painting, the form itself is created out of laying down color against color. So that's the distinction they're getting at. So for art, there are two main techniques that are in use at this time in the 15th century that you want to be able to understand and differentiate: engraving and woodblock. So the basic difference is engraving, which can also be called intaglio. You're using a metal plate. And in woodblock printing, you're using a wood plate. Each of these technologies is based on a very simple idea, which is essentially the idea of a stamp or an impression. And that is certainly not a new idea in the 1400s. In fact, the basic idea goes back thousands of years. You're looking here at a cylinder with engravings, carved figures, which is the forerunner of the print. Because what's happened is this cylinder has been used on wet clay as a stamp to make an impression that leaves the trace of the image. This is from ancient Sumer in today's Iraq, from about 3000 BCE. So this is 4,500 years before the 15th century North. It's also important to know that the Chinese and Koreans invented the technology that we call printmaking well before the Europeans did. It's actually common for major inventions to be created at separate times and places. That was the case with photography. The model of one single invention that spreads out from that first place, that is actually often not the case. So here you see a page of text and image that represents the earliest known dated book by the Chinese artist Wang Ji, portraying the Buddha giving forth the Diamond Sutra. As you read this section of the textbook, make sure you understand the difference between woodcuts and engravings in terms of the tools, the techniques, but also in terms of what the resulting artwork looks like. So here's a woodcut, and you'll see that it has these sort of strong, bold, dark lines. And if you move forward, you can contrast that with an engraving, which is where you have a metal tool called a burin, carving, engraving fine lines into a metal plate. And here you can see right away that the line work is often much more detailed, delicate, fine. The woodcut tends to give a coarser line than the engraving does. So along with those two techniques, a hugely important technology is using those possibilities of wood blocks or metal blocks to make movable type printing, in which individual letters could be arranged and locked together, inked and then printed onto paper. This is a way of creating books using modular units to save time, to save money, and to create mass production. So it's hugely important because we talked about how rare books were in the medieval world, handmade by scribes, one at a time, taking months to years. Now you've got a system where you can make numerous books, shifting the components of the movable type, and you are exploding the possibilities for knowledge, for art, for culture. So again, to debunk Eurocentric myths, this is not the invention of printmaking. It's already been invented, movable type printmaking, in China and Korea. In fact, they were moving toward that in the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907. And by the time we get Bi Sheng using baked clay, we have the system that will be perfected under the Yuan Dynasty using wooden movable type and then cast metal in Korea. The point I want you to understand is this enables 4 transformative implications. Mass production. Now you have images that can be sold for relatively cheap, and you can have a market for those images of people who would never have been able to afford the kind of artworks you've studied so far. This is also supporting the expansion of knowledge as you get illustrated books. The culture is reaching out to include artistic enjoyment for more socioeconomic classes, and that will also mean artistic independence. Someone like this artist, Martin Schongauer, can actually make a fantastic image relatively cheap for his own speculative interests, and then go and sell the sheets without having to invest a bunch of money up front. That's different than getting a commission like Giotto did from Enrico Scrovegni, where you're serving a master and you're completing a special commission. This is a model of art making where the artist's imagination and skill can possibly translate into getting a bigger market for your work. And this is going to free artists to be really working in a more direct art market. And in doing so can shape as well as respond to the demands of the market. So most artists working for major patrons had to really shape their vision toward the patron's preferences. Someone like Martin Schongauer, in working in this cheaper medium, has a lot more freedom to take risks. And we can see an example of this in these 3 prints that were made by someone who we know was Master ES, because his initials ES are on the works, and he's associated with a cathedral in Einsiedeln, Switzerland, where there was it was a pilgrimage site because there was a celebration of a miraculous appearance of the Virgin Mary. There was an apparition of the Virgin Mary. So he had a contract to actually create prints that would be souvenirs. And the interesting thing you see here is that he created them at 3 different price points. So this one is hugely complex. It's packed with many figures. It's his finest workmanship. He would have taken his most time here and he would have priced it at the highest price. If you want a mid-price, this one, all the figures are very well done, but he's really reduced the number of figures and kind of expanded the architecture to simplify the composition so he can do it at a reduced price. And this one, if you look really closely, he has actually really kind of cut corners on those figures. Let me see if I can get a close-up. Hold on. So for instance, look at baby Jesus. This poor little arm looks like it has no bones, or he had some terrible accident. And these eyes are so overly shaded and shadowed that they look sort of like ghoulish pumpkin jack-o'-lantern eyes. So this, of course, is not nearly as fine as what he's done over here. But remember, this was a time when images are incredibly rare. To be a peasant who's gone on pilgrimage and to be able to afford your own image of Mary and baby Jesus would have been a thrilling, incredible thing, because previously you would have never owned an image of your own. Images were only in cathedrals or palaces, that they were not part of everyday life.